in this bite-sized PD, we're going to be discussing pacing in the classroom. And when we're talking about pacing, we are talking about two types, either pacing within your lesson itself or pacing your curriculum, making sure that you get everything that you want to get, all the objectives within the school year without making it seem too overwhelming for your students or thinking that you're going too slow. So let's start thinking first with the actual pacing that happens in our classroom, which is our day to day pacing. And pacing is important because it really keeps our students engaged in what's going on with our classroom, right? So good pacing gives students this idea, an illusion of speed, that time kind of flies by and it doesn't seem like forever to get through a lesson. And that's if we're actually taking the time to plan out exactly how our lesson is going to be introduced, how it's going to be implemented, what our students are doing. Keeping all of these things in mind will help us create great pacing within our lesson. And giving the illusion of speed then gives our students that engagement that they need to continue paying attention to what's happening in class, which will also make classroom management and behavior a lot easier if everyone is engaged. So, one way to really create that illusion of speed is to create a variety of different activities to accomplish your lesson objectives, right? By moving from one activity to the next, by changing things up, and your students aren't doing the same thing. They're not just listening to a straight lecture, they're not just taking notes. It's not just one thing that's going on, but there is this creation of a variety that then allows you to change the pace of your lesson. So by changing that type of work, by changing the method of your presentations, whether you're giving a short lesson at one time and then they might be doing a video and then there's a short hands-on activity, then you might have a question or answer, however that might work. But by grouping these different activities, by grouping students together, kind of changing the way that things happen with the flow of your classroom throughout your time together, that creates the illusion of speed, but it also then keeps your students' minds engaged and it keeps them more open and prone to remembering and being able to understand everything that's happening in your class. So one way of pacing in the classroom is what's referred to as brightening the lines. And the brightening the lines is just reminding students of what's just been learned, right? Or what they're going to be learning and giving them clear timelines. So when you break up your time in your class, whether you are an all-inclusive teacher that you have the whole entire day and you're breaking things up by subject, that's very important since you're all together all day long, or whether you have a set time because you are just a content teacher and you have a set time, but taking that time frame and making sure that you are chunking it and breaking it up into different activities and actually giving those students those time frames and clear timelines helps to break up the pace of the class as well. So the more specific you are in brightening your lines, then it's even works even better. So really giving them a specific time frame that you have 10 minutes to complete this activity, right? We're going to be working on this question for 30 minutes. So having timers in your class, all of these different things help in chunking up your time together and brightening those lines so students can see clear delineations of different things that are happening. So some tips for pacing within your classroom lesson. Always work the lesson before facilitating with students, right? Plan out the lesson beforehand. Go over in your mind how that lesson's going to be broken down. It's good to have kind of what if scenarios. If you know certain students might struggle with something, what are you going to do to address that? Know where you want to be by the end of the period. Always start with a clear objective. Like, this is my goal, and I know by the end of this period, all of my students need to have done this. And also, what should they be able to do by the end of that period of time? Chunk your activities, and it doesn't mean that you have to do like one question at a time. You can chunk pieces together. So you can have questions that are related. You're going to do these three questions that are all related to, for example, main idea. I'm going to give you 15 minutes to work on that. So set those time limits, use a timer, whether it's an actual timer that you have in your class. There are great digital timers that you can display on your Sharp TV. Things like Classroom Screen is a great online site that allows you to use things like timers, and it has a lot of these classroom management things that are really great for chunking and breaking up your activities. Choose what pieces of your lesson are most important to talk about for your students to present out to the class. So if you're sharing something out and you're discussing something or you're going over questions, you don't have to go over every single thing that you do in your class. So really pick and choose, what are my most important objectives? What are my most important activities that really reflect those objectives, that hearing my students that they understand will let me know that they understand the overall goal of my lesson. So choose those pieces carefully, and that's what you can spend some time sharing out and discussing. But you don't need to share and go over every single little thing that you do, because that also takes up time and it becomes monotonous as well in your class. And so your students start to lose interest. Use all of your class time, right? Plan a warm up lesson, wrap up every day with an exit ticket just to go back to where we started, to make sure that your students understand what our goal and objective was. If you have materials for this particular lesson that you need, make sure they're ready and they're at hand to use. Come up with questions up front already, with possible questions or issues that your students might run into of whatever it is that you're doing in your class that time. So that will help you move your lesson in the right direction. That will help you anticipate potential problems with your students in class already and how you can address them. This is where those formative assessments that we've discussed before become so critical, because that allows you to know where your students stand already. So if you do a formative assessment, even a pre-formative assessment, which lets you know what they know already, that can help you in planning your next lesson. Because if your students are already knowing with some background information, you know that you can skip ahead over that because they know that background information. Or if they're missing some kind of foundational skill, you know that you can work that into your lesson beforehand. Okay, I need to spend some time working on this skill first before moving on to the next. So those formative assessments are really great at being able to set the pace of your lessons and mix things up. Don't always do the same types of activities or even every time, because your students will eventually get bored, and that definitely starts to slow the pace down. When you're feeling bored, that's when time seems to stop, right? And so that's when your pacing seems the slowest for your students. So you do have to try and keep that variety going as best as you can by integrating different types of activities, different methods of presentation. All of these different things help you with the pacing of your class within that particular lesson. So now let's take a look at the other type of pacing, which is your curriculum pacing, right? This is your bigger picture. What are the goals that I have for my class, for my course, for my students for the entire year? And you can break this up, of course, by quarter, if you want to do it by semester, however it is that would make the most sense to you. But this is where we can go ahead and start to chunk together what are the main objectives, what are these essential objectives or learning goals that my students need to achieve by the end of the year. And the great thing about our curriculum pacing is that the majority of our curriculums already have pacing guides available, especially from the district. So make sure that you are checking those pacing guides or curriculum maps, or sometimes they have these years at a glance that chunks the standards all together. But use those first as your foundation, right? That's already done for you, so why do the extra work? So take that, if you have already these pacing guides with your curriculum, and use that as your foundation to plan out your year. The first thing that we always need to do is really to take a look at those standards. What are the standards for my content? And from those standards, what are really the essential standards that my students really need to know to be able to understand the content? And if it's needed, those are the background standards that they're going to need it for the next course, right? So we know that we've given them those foundational skills that they'll need in the future. That's where we need to start. And you also need to consider, right, what's my grade level? And for my particular students that I might have my exceptional students. So I need to be able to also think about those students that have things like IEPs. If I have a content area that's a tested content area, right? What are the standards that are being tested? And what are some foundational skills that are needed within my content that they'll need that as a building block for the next one? So once we have identified these standards, right, it's we have to then go back and actually break apart these standards one by one by underlying those keywords that will help us break down that standard so we can actually make those like a learning objective, an actionable goal. And that's going to make things a lot easier when we plan out lessons, because when we see that actionable goal, it'll help us plan out lessons and activities where we can then have students show us that actionable goal, that they've understood it and have met that goal. Once you plug in those essential standards into your month by month calendar, you'll begin to be able to see how much time it's going to take you to be able to get through that. And as you plan out these lessons, this is where you then need to break down this essential standard. What's my lesson that I need to do? How much time am I going to have to spend doing this lesson for my students to understand that? And of course, this is something that as a pacing guide, it's going to have to work and change with the dynamic of your class, because depending on the groups of students that we have from year after year, your pacing will have to slow and speed up at certain parts. And that's where we're going back to those formative assessments. Is so important to make sure that during the lesson, we're checking for understanding as we go through it, because that's really going to help us with our pacing, not only within the lesson in our class, but also in the long term within our curriculum. It also helps us pace to where we are and where we need to be as we begin to understand the dynamics of our students. Once we have these target statements for our standards, right? We've broken those standards down into those actionable goals. Those actionable goals will then let us know, is there specific vocabulary that our students need to understand along with that standard? And then from there, we can begin to formulate what are the types of activities, what are the types of ways that I can assess that my students actually understood and can actually show me that actionable goal. And that would really be the easiest way to break down our curriculum and making sure that we are hitting those objectives when we are then having these lessons with our students. So, our key takeaways for this short bite-sized PD, really focusing on pacing. When we're pacing in our lessons in the classroom, by changing the activities, by changing our modes of presentations, the way that students are grouped together or working on these activities, these are all different ways that we can increase interest, and it increases the pace of our class. Chunk activities and set time limits, clear, definitive time limits for activities in our lessons. Have all our materials always ready. Use those formative assessments to determine what our students already know, as that will help us with the pace of our lesson in class and will help us with the pace of our curriculum as a whole throughout the year. And always making sure that we are identifying what are those essential standards, and we're using those as the backbone to our curriculum pace. So I hope this short bite-sized PD helped on pacing. And as always, thank you so very much for watching.